Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Civic University Network conference session, which is titled COVID, Communities and Change. My name is Emily Morrison, and I lead the Institute for Community Studies. I'll be hosting this session with Paul Manners, who's the co-director of the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement. And the ICS and the NCCPE are partners in the Civic University Network. So we may reflect a little bit on our own experience of change over the last 12 months later on in the session. But just to give you an idea of what the focus of both of our organisations is. So the ICS works to directly involve communities of place in understanding and shaping the conditions, issues and roles that affect their lives. And the NCCPE's mission is to support the university sector to develop stronger, more responsive engagement with communities. So working in strategic partnership with the Civic University Network, and particularly today's topic, has been really, really close to our hearts over the last 12 months. And we're really delighted that you can join us today for this fascinating session. So specifically, this session is going to focus on how has COVID-19 impacted on communities, and how has this changed how we need to work with and indeed for communities to support them? How have the community and charity sector had to change in response to the difficulties and the dynamics of COVID-19? And also to think about the future of communities and the challenges that we are going to face in the short and indeed in the longer term. And then specifically for a lot of you here in the audience who are from the higher education sector, how has this changed what may be needed of the higher education sector in working in partnership? We've got a fantastic panel and we can't wait to get started, but just a little bit of quick housekeeping to run through. Whilst I'm running through the housekeeping notes, please do use the chat to introduce yourselves. And if you like, tell us a little bit about what you would like to get out of the session as well. So just to let you know, this webinar will be recorded and it will be made available after the conference via the network members area. You can use the chat function throughout the session for general commentary and discussion. Please make sure to send to all panelists and attendees. If you have a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please use the Q&A function, which is in your bottom toolbar. Please do not post panel questions in the chat as we might not manage to see them. For optimal viewing, please select to hide non-video participants. The instructions to do this will be provided in the chat function just as we start. And also be sure, whilst you're listening, to visit our conference discussion board, the Play Space on Padlet. And here we would really like to hear your reflections on the challenges facing your local communities that you are working with or living within, And specifically, if you'd like to share a quick sentence on one thing that you're doing through your university or through your organisation to work with the local community, we would be really, really happy to hear that. And I'm going to just hand over to Paul Manners just to introduce the first part of our session.
Thanks, Emily, and it's really good to join you this morning. I'm hoping that Shireen, you could start my video. Okay, so very warm welcome. I think, isn't it great and isn't it convenient to be online and to be able to convene and gather like this? But for me, isn't it's also really, really frustrating in the sense just not to know who's in the room. So we would really love to know just a little bit about the audience, and I think that will really help our panelists as well. So we've just put four choices up on the screen. We wondered if you could just take a minute to tell us, are you working outside the sector and in relationship with universities? Are you working outside the university sector and not really working with universities? But also, are you working in a university setting and have a strong interest in community engagement? So if you look at those four options, it would be great if you could tell us about you. As Emily said, I work in a centre that's based in Bristol, and its job is to try and support universities to do better public and community engagement. So the topics of today's conversation, I think, are really, really important. So as you answer that framing poll, I think maybe, Emily, it would be really nice to just introduce our three panelists. And then we'll come back to a second question, which is to ask you about your reflections on what's been happening in the work that you do. So Emily, I'll hand back to you, and maybe you could set up our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Paul. So I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists. So we have with us today Vidya Alexson, who is the Chief Executive of Power to Change, who specifically focus on supporting the community business sector to thrive and flourish. We have Carl Wilding, who was the previous Chief Executive of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. And we have Farah Elahi, who is the Interim Head of Community Engagement for the Greater London Authority. So they all bring very, very different perspectives. And they're all going to offer a quick 2-minute reflection on their experience and their organisation's experience over the last year. So I'd like to hand over to Vidya to kick us off, if that's all right. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Emily. Great to be here. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to join you today. So as Emily already said, Power to Change focuses on community-led businesses. So these are businesses that are locally rooted, led by local people, and work for the benefit of their local community. Most of them have a trading model that underpins what they do, and that's part of what defines them as a community business. So as with many small businesses across the country, they were particularly affected by COVID-19, given the restrictions around social distancing and lockdown. So what we saw really over the last year was a combination, I think, of huge adaptability and innovation, which I think is also characterized by small businesses beyond the social purpose sector, but many businesses repurposing to continue to deliver their priorities, to continue to meet the needs of their communities at rapid pace. So shifting their entire service delivery online within a week, closing the doors of the community pub or shop and turning to food delivery services, a whole range of activities and adaptation that was really amazing to see and incredibly impressive. We also were really pleased to see a lot more resilience in the sector than we expected. So actually very few community businesses so far have gone under. Many of them, the vast majority of those who closed their doors expect to reopen their doors. So we were a lot more worried about what might happen at the very beginning of the pandemic than actually what has happened subsequently. And we were very involved in providing emergency funding as part of trying to support the sector to get through. I think when I sort of pause now, I actually am more worried about what's going to happen in the next year. And I think we may look back at the last year and think, well, actually that was the easier period, because actually emergency funding is going to now has effectively stopped. So most of the grants that were given came to an end at the end of March. So the final dregs of emergency funding are working their way through. Furlough is going to start to unwind. Some of the other sort of supports that have been out there are going to start to wane. So in a funny way, although it's been hugely traumatic the last year and very dramatic, I think some of the pain is yet to come. And so my worry really is for the next year to next 2 years. And when I talk to community business leaders, they're incredibly exhausted. Weariness is something they talk about all the time, but actually they are really uncertain about what's to come. You know, many of them have to rethink their business models, but as I think many of us are unclear about what the future is going to look like, the new normal feels quite far away still. And getting through, I think, the next year or two is probably going to turn out to be a bigger challenge than just getting through the last 12 months, which was already big enough.
Thank you so much, Vidya. And I mean, really good to hear a positive story in some ways of the last year, but also some kind of very cautionary words for the future. Carl, can I hand over to you for your perspective?
Morning, everyone. Thank you for, as Vidya said, thank you for the opportunity to take part today. And in many respects, I think what I've got to say echoes what Vidya has just said. It's no surprise that we sort of refer to COVID and the crisis as this great acceleration, and some of the changes that I think were going on in the sector already in terms of, say, the shift to digital and becoming more digital organizations. COVID accelerated lots of that change in a sort of a relatively short amount of time. As Vidya also said, it's been a huge challenge in terms of it's been incredibly disruptive of business models and operating models. And there's a bit of an irony for many voluntary organizations that the big orthodoxy of the last 20 or 30 years is to become more like social enterprises. Well, they're the organizations that have actually in some respects have quite struggled in during COVID because they haven't had grant funding or so on that that might have sort of kept them afloat otherwise, and their businesses have been sort of under pressure. Just one point about what Vidya said about the sort of the coming year forward. I absolutely agree with that. Trusts and foundations have really stepped up to the mark in terms of they've not just accelerated some of the grant funding that they've made available, but they've also become much more flexible with that funding. But that period's drawing to a close. And I am very mindful. I spoke to an insolvency practitioner the other day who said to me that what you see in all recessions is that most failures are not actually in the recession; they're on the way out of the recession. So it resonates what Vidya said. But being positive, as is the case with all sort of crises, we see good things come out, and communities absolutely stepped up and responded in this crisis. And that's from individuals sewing scrubs for sort of hospital staff through to the establishment of, we think, about 3,000 mutual aid groups across the country. I think that we're not clear about what the lifetime of some of these groups is going to be. I think as I'm running out of time, the other thing that I will just say is that there's been a big change in terms of collaboration. And it's interesting, you know, we almost frame the discussion today by saying which sector have you come from or where have you come from? And actually one of the things that might be a positive sort of going forward is that we stop thinking about sector and instead we just think about what's our mission, what are we trying to solve? And that's the defining frame for working together, not where do we start from.
Thank you, Carl. That's really interesting and good provocations there as well. And Farah, if I could ask you to offer your perspective from the communities that you're working with.
Thanks, Emily. And the challenge and the kind of opportunity with going last is always that what's come before, the kind of main points are always landed before you've started. But I'm going to take advantage of that by going slightly more abstract in my response, because, you know, completely agree with what Carl and Vidya have already said in terms of some of the patterns that we're seeing on the ground. I guess two things that we've been reflecting on a lot in our team and in London. The first is kind of really around what were the things that enabled us to work more effectively in the context of COVID response? What were the, you know, and primarily that's around relationships, like where we'd invested in relationships and built trust. We were able to mobilize so quickly, but also we were able to extend and build so many new relationships across the city. But also thinking a lot about infrastructure. It's, you know, Carl will know about, you know, the challenges of kind of convincing people about the value and importance of infrastructure pre-COVID was quite significant. And then suddenly everyone is kind of really pro-infrastructure, which is amazing. You know, it was something that was really a priority for us before COVID as well. And actually, we just funded 5 new, not new, but entered into a funding relationship with 5 equality-led infrastructure organizations in March of 2020, which was just kind of timing-wise so lucky, because we were able, that was kind of so kind of critical to us being able to address some of the equality challenges that came up as part of COVID. But I think it's about kind of recognizing what are the systems and processes and infrastructure that we need to invest in always, so that we can have that resilient response that Vidya was talking about. The other kind of thing that the question made me reflect on is this framing around how we work with communities. And it's something that I hear a lot, both within the GLA, but also from different civil society groups, but like, we need to make sure we work with communities. And I'm always really kind of interested in like, who are these communities and where are they and why are we not those communities? And I'm not being naive. I understand there's structural inequalities and there are voices that are missing and there are people that aren't around the table. But I feel like often we don't, in the way we set up these questions, we kind of keep a distance between us and them. You know, I'm not sure that's going to be up to the task of addressing the structural challenges and inequalities we face. Like over the last year, every time I've been kind of really sure of my perspective and feeling very righteous about like, this is the thing that's wrong, I've constantly been challenged to be like, actually, it's more complex, and actually it's not about the individual really, it's about the system. And, you know, I think that there's something in how we set up our relationships with each other that keeps us focused on the individual rather than the system, and the system that drives the unequal outcomes. And that was just what I was reflecting on this morning when I was preparing my notes. And I think, you know, if we're in how we work with community, that feels like a really critical question for me, is, you know, why do we always separate ourselves from them rather than feeling like we are part of them? And I guess that kind of links to the point Carl was making as well, in terms of, you know, who's the university sector. You know, like people will say to me like, we need to listen to people with lived experience, but like, I have lived experience as well. And, you know, like all of those things. I've probably definitely gone over my time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, everybody. And I think we've now got our poll results in. So Shireen, maybe you could just give us a picture of who's in the audience. And it's, you know, as expected, I think the dominant membership of the audience are people who are focused on community engagement in a university setting. So about half of us have that role, and that would certainly be how I would describe mine. It's wonderful to welcome people who are outside the university sector, taking on board all of Carl's points about actually this is about collaboration, this isn't about where we start. But I hope that that's just a little bit helpful to give us a kind of picture of where we're all working. And in a minute, I might just come back to our 3 panelists to just get a bit more of a concrete sense of what you do actually, where you work and what you do. Just to give us a real flavour of your practical day-to-day experience that you've lived through over the last 12 months. But before we do that, we've got a second poll that we'd love you to reflect on, which is to again invite you to tell us how you are making sense of the challenges around community at the moment. And these are quite complex statements because it's a complex situation, and we've just offered you 4 ways of thinking about the extent to which COVID has led to really negative impacts, or it's a mixed picture. How are you making sense of it? So take a few minutes to just sort of to look at those, and as we're talking, please do let us know how you're making sense of the situation. And while you're doing that, Carl, I wondered if I could just come back to you briefly, and could you tell us just a little bit about the work you've actually been doing over the last sort of 12 to 15 months? And then I'll come to you, Farah, and then back to Vidya, just to give us a sense of what sort of part you've played. So Carl, over to you.
So when I was at NCVO, we were probably doing 2 things, and indeed NCVO is still doing them. So the first was very much about practical support. And one of the things that I felt proud of what we did was that even though we were a membership organization and some of our sort of advice and support was behind a paywall, we just dropped that immediately because we just thought that this was too important as a crisis. actually some of the feedback from members, which you might be interested in, was that they thought that that was a good thing, that at a time of crisis like this, pulling together is far more important than whether or not someone has paid a membership fee and so on. So, and video will also, I guess, and Farah will have experience of this as well. People need really practical support about things like, if I'm holding an AGM, can I hold that online, and do I need permission from the regulator? Or just simple things like, how do you use Microsoft Teams? How do you get it to work? And for us, we're a sector that broadly speaking doesn't have the sort of capital reserves available for investment in technology. So some of this has been a very, very sort of sharp and sudden sort of jolt to the system in terms of new ways of working and so on. And indeed, as we're now sort of all having these discussions about not just sort of the drift back to the office, but literally about the future of work and so on, organizations need really practical help on how to be COVID resilient. Whether that's about how do you make the office sort of hygienic and so on, through to sort of just for example, things like this. So what happens if half of your office staff are in the office and the other half are at home? What are the implications in terms of office culture and so on, and sort of getting that right so that people aren't excluded.
Thank you.
Just quickly, Paul, one of the things that we have done, and I'll probably return to this later in terms of questions, has been about advocacy. Farah talked about the fact that there's advocacy on behalf of people out there, and the fact that well, to use that old expression, we might all be in the same storm, but we certainly weren't all in the same boat. And sort of advocacy on behalf of communities, and I presume I don't need to say more there, but also advocacy on behalf of the sector. So as Vidya said, this is a sector that I would argue is critical to the sort of the health and success of communities, but it's not one that's taken seriously. And one of my big frustrations and learnings from the pandemic, and you still see this now with vaccination, is that government doesn't look to communities for answers. It doesn't look to people and places. I mean, as people in Bolton are saying right today, we are a very centralized top-down society, and trying to sort of highlight that community organizations, that people getting involved in their communities, that they have some of the answers. That's been one of the big things that we've been trying to do and still need to do.
Great, thank you. And Farah, could you just explain a little bit about your role at the Greater London Authority?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that we as a team always really struggle to explain, like what to our families, like what do you actually do? And so we kind of tried to come up with something simple that we thought people would be able to kind of follow. And we talk about our team as bridging the divide between Londoners and City Hall. And probably during COVID, we expanded that remit to not just it being about between Londoners and City Hall, but about between Londoners and different parts of the system. So a lot of what we did over the last year, and more generally, is kind of convening people, bringing people together, developing spaces for people to tell their stories, to kind of capture insights, and a space for people to connect, but then also sharing that back with Londoners themselves first and foremost, but also with different parts of the system. So at the moment, for example, we're doing lots of work to support vaccine take up, whether that involves a monthly public health briefing that brings communities together with Public Health England and NHS England to kind of hear from each other and connect, whether that's a monthly kind of community survey where we try and pull out community perspective and what people are seeing on the ground and share them back with the system. But there's a lot of kind of convening and connecting and sharing of stories, and kind of always everyone will know from the kind of the public sector, the focus on polling and quantitative data, and our team is really there to try and complexify the story and share more about lived experiences and kind of creative methodologies for understanding what's happening on the ground.
Great.
Can I just also, there was a question about infrastructure, and it kind of connects a little bit to what we do as a team, because I guess the traditional definition of infrastructure is a second tier or a civil society support organization that provides voice, networking, and capacity building. But I often think of infrastructure in terms of like a trellis or scaffolding. It's something you put in place to support something to grow and flourish, and a supportive structure in place. And I feel like our team also tries to think about that in terms of community voice in London, and what are the systems we can put in place to support that to kind of come out and be shared across the system and be understood better.
Yeah, Thank you, Farah. That's fantastic. And Video Power to Change is a funder, and I think you explained that your focus is on community businesses. But again, any reflections on your role in this system?
Yeah, so I mean, the experience for us was essentially to pause all of the 20 or so programs that we had running at the time, and repurpose our entire team and our money to COVID emergency. So we found, sort of from the money that we were going to deploy in other ways, 12.5 million that we then deployed to support organizations with the year that was to come. And I think the two sort of central bits of that for us, or probably three, were: one, we shifted to core grants quite dramatically and in a much bigger way than we were doing before. So it was clear that actually what organizations needed was support to use in whichever way they needed. And us sitting there trying to decide what project to fund was completely useless under the circumstances. So we did that. We also opened our funding up to organizations that hadn't been funded by us before. So we were really clear that as a funder that supports community businesses, we were there for the entire sector and not just for those who had been lucky enough, the 1,000 or so who'd been lucky enough to be funded by us. So emergency funding was available to any community business, whether they'd had a previous relationship with us or not. And I think the third bit was, we heard very clearly from community businesses that we shouldn't blow it all in the first 3 or 4 months. So there was a real anxiety that everything was going to collapse by June. You know, this is 12 March. And actually the community businesses are saying, hold on, you know, we think we need a bit more of a medium-term response, not just, it's not all going to be sorted in the next few months. And I think it's hard to remember back then, but I think most of us did think this was a 6-month sort of thing, not a 2 to 3 year thing, which it's turning into. So we were really lucky to get that wisdom from the sector, and we then sort of held back 5 million for what we our medium-term response, which is currently going on, which is more still embedded in core grants largely, but actually using the money to enable businesses to pivot their business models, which is going to be the thing that gives them medium-term resilience. So I mean, the other things that were significant for us is we've spent a lot of time trying to convince government of the value of community, and you know, we can come back to that. I mean, Carl was doing a superhuman effort on advocacy for the sector overall. You know, all of us have played smaller parts in terms of trying to build an understanding with the government for the sector and for the communities, the role that they play. So that was a significant part of what we did as well. But other things that were really important to us were work that we did with ICS, for example, to actually understand and hear the voices of community. You know, we're not a frontline organization, we're sort of an intermediate organization where we sit one removed from those who are really making change. So we put in lots of processes to enable us to hear more quickly than we would have done normally what was going on, what people were feeling, what was happening, what was needed. And that was very, very helpful in terms of being able to right size our response to what was actually going on.
Wonderful. And in a minute, we're going to sort of invite each of you to reflect on what you have heard really about the biggest sort of issues or challenges for the communities that you work closest with. But before we do that, can we just see the results of that poll, Shireen? And there have been some really interesting comments in the chat about how we framed these questions. But maybe if I just quickly run through, and it's very interesting that the first of these has only a very sort of small number of responding. So COVID has had a profoundly negative impact on building strong local partnerships and has negatively affected how we can support communities of place. That isn't something that many people at all felt is true. And I'm just jumping across to the comment from Natalie in the chat where she says, I think it's interesting that 3 of the statements include the word challenging or negative. And she's saying COVID has proved an immensely positive impact on engaging with our communities, identifying local challenges, and harnessing our university resources would be more accurate from the perspective of the University of East London. The second comment was COVID has had a challenging impact on building strong local partnerships and is creating tensions as well as opportunities in how we can support communities of place. So that had 18%. COVID has had a challenging impact on building strong local partnerships, but is creating new ways of positive working in how we can best support communities of place, has 41. So I think very much, Natalie, picking up on your point that there are some really positive sort of opportunities. And finally, COVID was the wake-up call needed to shift how we can best support communities in place and feel positive. I feel positive about the future of this work. So really interesting in the room, but I think a very strong sense of a mixed picture, and there are some real sort of positives and opportunities that we hope we can pick out. And as we move through the session, begin to think about the implications of those for the university sector. And I really read sort of, I also feel very like the last category. I'm still trying to make sense of the impact. Nearly 10% of us, I think. Yeah. Okay. So Emily, I don't know whether you'd be happy to sort of move us into the next sort of part of the discussion, where we're going to be asking people to reflect on the biggest sort of issues and challenges, but I'll hand back over to you, I think.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for taking part in that poll so quickly and warmly, and it is really interesting to see the kind of mixed perspective in the room. So just a question to all of our panelists, and please do answer it from whichever perspective, which is, what is the single biggest challenge that you see facing the communities that you're working with, or you can think about the whole kind of sector working in place as a whole in the, I suppose, the next 2 years, really? And Vidya, you touched a little bit on this, and so did Carl and Farah, but just really if there's one single biggest challenge, and if you could perhaps reflect, does this represent a big shift, or is this a continuation of a challenge that was there before? If I can be, sort of that nuanced. So, and whoever would like to go in first, perhaps if I go to Farah first, if that, as you're unmuted, that would be fantastic.
Accidental unmuting. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, and we over the last year we've been running a regular London community response survey and one of the kind of common core questions has been, what's the biggest challenge for you as an organization? What's the biggest challenge for Londoners on the ground? And it's been pretty consistent in what the top 5 challenges across both of those are. And like for organizations, it's been around planning for the future, capacity to meet demand, funding sustainability, staff well-being. But actually, when I was trying to think, okay, well, actually the question you've posed is, what's the single biggest challenge? And I think there's something around, there was this kind of window in the first few months of the crisis where, anything felt possible, and it felt like you could really see the structural inequalities in the system, and there was like activity that was going on that was really challenging those structural inequalities. And I think probably like people have a taste of that, and that's really where the work they want to do as community organizations, as civil society groups, is around kind of creating new structures. And the further we get away from that kind of initial period, the harder that seems to become. So a lot of the responses that we've had to surveys around, from food banks being like, there's so much demand, there's so much complexity, there's so much need on the ground, but we also know that like there's an issue with the way we're working, and we're not actually addressing the root cause of the issue in how we're working. And so I think there's a big challenge for all of us to kind of know how to work in a way that actually addresses structural inequalities rather than just kind of services the fallout of structural inequalities or addresses the fallout of structural inequalities. And that feels like a really big challenge for all of us.
Thank you, Farah. And I think that I also recognise that window very much from what a lot of our community advisory board was saying, in terms of it was almost as if the huge kind of, I think someone mentioned the word dramatic earlier, the kind of dramatic moment also became a kind of moment of hope in an odd sense. But then how do we kind of actually make that into practice moving forward? Vidya, can I come to you on the same question?
Sure. So this is a personal perspective, so I can share with you what some of the community organisations, the leaders that we work with, are saying in a second, and some of it I've already touched on. But I think for me, the single biggest issue facing communities is the ongoing, and I think it's getting worse, centralisation of power and resource that we see in the country. So one of the things I found, I think, most disappointing about the last year is that I thought, naively as it turns out, the moment for communities has arrived, in that, COVID was the manifestation of everything we banged on about for ages, about what community can do. It's the first line of defense, blah, blah, blah. We were seeing it all. The news was constantly talking about mutual aid groups. Everyone was raving about what was going on. People were talking about their own personal experience of WhatsApp groups in their local communities, etc. But then, so I expected there to be then sort of some follow through in terms of particularly government how government then responded in terms of, you know, the levelling up agenda and all of these new big agendas around fixing inequality in the country. And actually what we've seen is no demonstrable trust in communities and what they can do. And, you know, all of the funding is being held in central pots that people have to compete with. And what we're hearing from community leaders on the ground is they have no direct access to any of those pots of money unless their work is the pet project of the local authority or the combined authority or some other power holder within the system, or they can really get the ear of their MP. They have no way of really accessing that funding. And so, you know, as I've done the work at Power to Change over the last 6 years, I mean, I think I've become a more and more sort of militant about the need for devolution to better support a strong communities agenda. I think it's very hard. The gap between a very centralized state and local communities is so huge. And I think I have much more kind of hope for those areas of the country where we have devolved administrations like London, where power does sit a lot closer to, I think it's still quite far away, but it sits a lot closer to people. So, you know, I think for me, that's been one of the most disappointing aspects of the last year. And I sort of look at myself and think, well, I was just being naive. Like, actually, you know, change doesn't necessarily happen despite evidence of what's possible. On the flip side, on a much more positive side, we recently convened 40 community business leaders and community leaders of different kinds. We are involved in convening this thing called a community power group, which needs a better name, but that's all the only name it's got for the moment, to try to grow community power sort of in the country and to try and bring organizations together that work on community power. And the one thing that was really striking about that was how much of a shared agenda those 40 leaders had. So they don't know each other necessarily, they don't work together, but they're all doing similar work across the country, trying to build up the capacity and the power of their communities. And it was very clear that they feel a commonality between themselves, and that's rooted in a desire and a feeling that local people and communities should have more control over their lives and more ability to shape the places that they're in. So I'm sort of hopeful that actually, you know, the top's not getting it, but at the grassroots, there is this growing movement of people who really feel that change should be more locally rooted, should be more driven by communities, and they're starting to build alliances. And hopefully we as organizations can accelerate that and augment it and give that power more voice and more heft, I think.
Thank you, Vidya. And I wouldn't beat yourself up about the naivety, because I was, you know, also in that amazing heyday at the beginning, basically. And I think also in some ways, from what our board says, that communities were themselves as well, you know, this amazing ability to realize what you can do. And then obviously, as it's got longer and longer, the challenges have just mounted and mounted, including, as I think it was Carl said, the weariness as well of still plugging the gaps. Carl, over to you for your perspective.
The first thing I just want to say is that everything that all three of you have just said just really resonates. I mean, I could like 1,000 times. In these sorts of conversations, you know, especially if you're an infrastructure sort of like person, you're contractually obliged to begin by saying funding and sustainability is the biggest single challenge that organizations face. And, you know, it's sort of true, but I mean, almost going to Farah's point about root causes, I mean, I wonder what the root cause of the sustainability and funding problem is. And in that sense, I almost want to go back a step and say, for me, the biggest single challenge that we face going forward is relevance. And making sure that the way that we deliver our services, the people that we involve and engage, you know, whether that be advocates and so on, that we are sort of dealing with these issues in ways that are relevant to how people live their lives. Because I sometimes worry about our sector that we all, like, Vidya's right, that we're not having influence at the centre or at the top, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes we can fall into a trap of just blaming them. And some of that is about us. And one of the things that I worry about is that sometimes, for example, during COVID, we're very good at articulating a story of why we have problems and government needs to support us, but we've been less good at articulating why we are the solution and actually all the things that we're doing that are sort of relevant. And if we don't get that right, a sort of a related challenge to this is, and I fret about this, is that policymakers take all the wrong lessons from COVID and civil society. And top of my list there is that they just look at this massive upsurge in informal volunteering that we've seen, and they just sort of think, oh crikey, look at all that free stuff. We don't need to support the sector anymore because like communities will just do it themselves, and like we can just like step aside.
So thank you very much. You mentioned, Carl, civil society, and I think one of the things we're really interested in getting your reflections on is how the last sort of 12-15 months have changed how you understand civil society actually and how it works, because I think it underpins this whole notion of the civic university being part of civil society. And Vidya, you very eloquently described those issues around perhaps central control and devolved power, etc., as coming very sharply into relief for you. But I just wondered if we could maybe, if I come back to you, Vidya, to start with, how your sense of civil society has shifted or changed, if at all.
I think for me, what's coming through, and it's also manifesting in the work of others, is the value of civil society to national resilience. There's a tendency to think of this stuff as nice to have, sort of fluffy somehow. But I think what the pandemic has revealed is that it is integral to our resilience as a country. And I think that's coming through in the work of the British Academy, the major report that they did on that ICS was involved in on the COVID decade, you know, that strong civil society and social infrastructure is critical to the resilience of the country going forward. And if we want to rebuild and address inequality, etc., that there needs to be strength in that aspect of our country. We're also seeing it in the work of the Bennett Institute at Cambridge, their work on social infrastructure. So I think where I'm hopeful is that there is a growing understanding that if we want to address particularly regional and place-based inequalities, that investment in physical infrastructure, which is where the drive kind of currently isn't enough. And that's now being evidenced not just in the experience that we had in COVID, but then in academic work that's trying to sort of push that further. So in that sense, I'm encouraged that that we are starting to value civil society. I think we've got a way to go to convince government a bit of that and to really get funding to reflect that. But there is a growing group of both academics and experts and people working on the ground, practitioners, who are really starting to, I think, mobilize behind the idea that civil society is fundamental to our national resilience and to creating a more equal country in lots of different ways.
Thank you. Great. Farah, how about for you and your sense of civil society?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting. At the beginning of the crisis, one thing that became really clear is really the value of the small grassroots local organizations, because they were the only ones that were able to actually reach people. So a lot of the bigger organizations, a lot of the national organizations, weren't on the ground and didn't have the relationships to be able to mobilize immediately. And so there was this kind of immediate focus on hyperlocal, grassroots, community-led organizations. But actually what was really powerful is to see how kind of the constellation arranged itself. So you had a lot of the national players stepping in to think about how they can support the local players in like really powerful, interesting ways, and kind of much more of a move away from an either or to a like, what are the unique contributions that different layers of the ecosystem contribute and how can they work better together? I think one of the big challenges, and kind of picking up on what Vidya and Carl have been talking about in terms of like how we tell that story, and something that I really, really struggle with is, I think some of the ways in which we kind of central government maybe expect stories to be told is not a format or a language that works for civil society. And there's a kind of a round peg, square hole, like, and it's kind of, where do we bend and compromise the story so that it fits into the kind of input-output models that doesn't actually kind of fundamentally compromise what civil society is about. Like, it doesn't fit into neat boxes. It's not linear. It's messy and complex and nuanced and diverse, and like you can't put your fingers around it. And that's actually the power of it. But then you also need to be able to put your fingers around it in order to make that case But it's like, you know, there's it doesn't feel like we can win that argument on these kind of the current terms of the debate, because the terms of the debate sometimes kind of cut out what's really fundamental to what civil society is actually about. But I mean, I also think we need to find a way to tell that story compellingly and convincingly. And I agree with Carl, I don't think we've figured that out yet, but I struggle with knowing how to do that without kind of cutting out the heart of what civil society is also sometimes.
Thank you so much. And shortly, we're going to start looking at the role of universities in and their potential contribution. But I think what both Farah, you and Vidya have both sort of alluded to almost is that there's a real kind of almost conceptual, philosophical, intellectual challenge to just sense make really actually about what is going on, what is shifting, and what does that mean for practical kind of action. So that role potentially of universities contributing to that sense making, as well as also earlier you were all talking, I think, a little about the sort of practical ways in which universities as partners in place can contribute. So it'll be interesting to begin to reflect on the role of universities in civil society. But Carl, your thoughts about civil society?
It was interesting just listening to Farah then. Reminds me of an academic called Jeremy Kendall who describes civil society as a loose and baggy monster, which I've always quite liked. I think the first thing, actually, just to sort of build on what you said then, is that the best definition of civil society I've come across is from a guy called Mike Edwards, formerly from the Ford Foundation, who said that there are three sort of dimensions. One is associational life, which we've been discussing, but the other is civil society as a space where we come together. And the third element is civil society as a normative sort of element of the sort of society that we want to live in. And I think what I've sort of, not discovered, but I've thought about a bit in the last few months about civil society is that government's very fixated on the associational life and to be blunt, the service delivery and that sort of role. It seems rather less keen on civil society as a place where we come together and discuss things, because that leads to sort of advocacy. And that's one of the big things that has come out. It's not come out of COVID, but again, that idea of COVID as an accelerator, I think COVID has accelerated the advocacy stream, which I think has been growing for a few years now. Listening to both Vidya and Farah talk as well, it's reminded me that so much of what we do when we're talking about civil society, we do talk about the service delivery role, or we talk about the advocacy role, or even the community building stuff in terms of volunteering. But there's a bit of work from Johns Hopkins University, from the Centre for Civil Society there, and they talk about the 5 strengths of nonprofits. And one of them that I've thought about more than anything over the last few months is what they call the expressive and leadership development role. So this idea that civil society is a place where we come together, where we can express our values and our interests, and we can think about purpose and what we want from life. And for me, that's one of the things that I think that we should be talking about much more going forward. Is not the role of charities and voluntary organisations just in delivering services or contributing to the economy, but actually giving people purpose. And when they're not getting that from their work, or they're reevaluating what their working lives are about, I think there's a real role there. And when we talk about left behind places or levelling up and so on, this is the thing that I think we've got to talk more about.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Emily in a second. Just a reminder that we're shortly coming to the Q&A, so please do use the Q&A function if you've got a question for the panel. And also thank you for the chat. It is absolutely fascinating to try and follow that as well as to listen to the conversation, but really, really appreciate the feedback people are giving. And Carl, you mentioned a couple of things there. If panelists, if there are particular links that you'd like to share with people, please do. It would be really useful for people. I'm sure they'd love to follow up on those things. So Emily, back to you.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you very much, everyone, for those. I feel we're in the course of the discussion kind of neatly sort of moving from the conceptual to the very kind of gritty grassroots and back again, which is exactly what we'd hoped, and I'm absolutely kind of gripped as well. I think if I can just turn to the fact that obviously we're at the Civic University Network Conference, so a crucial role here is what is the role of higher education institutions and further education institutions in the challenges that we face for communities in the future. And perhaps if I could ask all of the panelists to reflect particularly on, are there experiences you've had working with universities that you think are strong models for addressing future challenges that we face? And are there things universities could bring in partnership with civil society or with community organisations, local authorities? Are there things they could bring that would help to solve or support some of these issues that the sectors that you work in are facing, recognising that we all have very different strengths, universities occupy a different role in the landscape. So just a sort of follow-up question there, are there things universities could particularly focus on bringing to these partnerships that would really make a difference to communities and civil society? And perhaps if I can go back to Farah again for the first response, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I mean, simple answer is yes. I think there's so much that universities can offer to kind of the wider kind of social agenda around this. And I guess reflecting on the conversation we've been having so far, but I don't think we can separate the what from kind of starting with relationships, because actually it's not, you can't start with kind of knowing what you can offer outside of being in relationship with your local community and being present, because that it's kind of the most useful thing that you can do emerges out of that. And there's something that we've learned a lot. So we did like a peer research citizen-led project, and a lot in the evaluation, the thing that groups had said was most valuable beyond the kind of research that we'd funded them to do or the insights that had been generated was actually just the relationships that they developed with City Hall through the project. So the fact that they knew someone they could email to say, actually, I need support with this, who do I go to? And that being the kind of foundation and the basis for kind of interesting and different things that can emerge out of that. But until you're in that relationship, I don't know that you can kind of understand what's needed locally. But there's so much asset that sits within Civic University, so much resource that can be better unlocked and connected with kind of what's happening on the ground there. And I'm sure loads of people on this call are already in that space and are kind of really in relationship with communities in meaningful ways. And I just want to share an example as well of a project that I think has been really interesting to see how it has been useful for communities. So there's a project called Beyond Bangla Town, which is a research project between Manchester, LSE, Cambridge, and the Runnymede Trust. And it was kind of really mapping the stories of Brick Lane and the businesses and the communities on there, and a really, really powerful project and the way they've presented it. But actually that research having been done and done in a way that's rooted in communities also has now there's a whole controversy around regeneration of that area, and that research is critical to the community mobilization to protect community assets. So it's a kind of both in terms of like how you can share your meeting rooms and your spaces and your kind of intellectual assets and resources, but also just how can you do research that actually supports the kind of the work that communities are trying to put forward.
Thank you, Farah. And I think there's a lot of people here who are very interested in how their research agendas can better serve, the issues faced by the local area. So thank you for that really tangible project example. Vidya, can I go to you next? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I mean, there's so much great stuff happening already, and I'm sure everyone on the call is involved in brilliant projects. I'll just give some examples, but I wanted to first say, I mean, Farah's point about being in relationship, I mean, it's absolutely critical. I mean, that is clearly the way to start. And actually, so much of what will come out of that relationship will be the right and the best ideas, rather than any ideas you might have sitting on your own in isolation. I've tried to sort of think about it in categories, just to sort of structure it. But I think research, the research heft and skill that universities can bring to community organisations is huge. So one really powerful example that we've been part of is some work that the Heseltine Institute at Liverpool University have done in partnership with the social enterprise and community business sector in the city region of Liverpool. That work, by just evidencing the significance of the sector in the city region, has unlocked £5.5 million from the combined authority, along with £1 million from us, to create a new social investment vehicle for the city region, hopefully in perpetuity. So there's real power that evidence and research used in the right way can unlock for community organisations. I think there's a huge value in the spaces that universities have. So, what can be done with those spaces? How many, can you incubate community businesses? Can you incubate community organisations? Can you provide space for them to grow? There's obviously the whole role of universities as anchors. What can you do with your purchasing power? Can you support more local businesses, local community organisations through that purchasing power? I also think it's interesting, we're seeing interesting examples of how community organisations are supporting universities to deliver their priorities around access, for example. So there's a really interesting collaboration between Wellspring Settlement, which is a long-standing sort of 30 years in the community anchor organisation, working with Bristol University, and they're creating a sort of adjunct of the main campus of the university in Barton Hill, which is one of the most deprived parts of Bristol, to try and get people from the wrong side of the tracks, as they are putting it, to access the university and its resources and its facilities. So they're actually moving the university to where the people are that they want to access the facilities, recognising that given where the university currently is, that's unlikely to happen. So I think the priorities can go both ways. So I think it's not just about what universities can do to support community organisations. Community organisations can also be, important routes for skill development for researchers, and also help with some of those access requirements. And then we're seeing interesting partnerships which really are about the future of the place, not any one sector. So coming back to Carl's point from right at the beginning about shared mission. So just a really interesting collaboration happening in Brighton between the university and Brighton Energy Co-op, which is using the university as the site for developing electric vehicle installations. So that's not really about either one of those. It's about net zero and about the future of Brighton and how transportation works in the city. And those two organisations are collaborating, one community, one higher education. So I think that really speaks to Carl's point about, can you have a joint mission that's about your place and change in your place that both organisations can be part of? So, when I asked the team about examples, I got inundated. Like, this is I sort of regretted posting it on the internet thing. I was like, oh my God, this is a really rich agenda and there's so much going on. I think my hope is that we're doing this together as partners rather than two communities, or with I think Farah's point from earlier on about actually universities are part of their community. So rather than this being a sense that we're doing something with community, it's two parts of the community coming together to do something, I think is probably the way I would like to see it being thought about.
Thank you, Vidya, and I couldn't agree more. We're working on some civic university agreements with institutions at the moment, and that sense of being one, even if we recognise we have different privileges, statuses, identities, I think is going to be so important to having a united front that can achieve change in the next few challenging years. So thank you so much. Carl, over to you, and then we'll start to take some questions, because we've got a lot coming in, which is fantastic. So.
Well, in which case, I'm not sure I can really add to what Vidya said about the role of universities in places, other than to say that I mean, clearly sort of being part of your community, not just this idea that they're two separate sort of town and gown, those have got to come together. That strikes me as important. I really like this idea of being mission focused, and to go back to an earlier commentator about positive things that have come out of COVID, it is this idea that it's more the case that we are putting mission before organization, that this idea of whether you call it systems leadership or not, this idea that we're trying to sort of address sort of problems before putting our organization's interests first. I've seen more of that, and there's a really good case study of that. If you haven't seen it, the Government's Industrial Strategy Council released a paper about how do we manage to produce a vaccine so quickly, and it talked about this mission-based approach that was a partnership between government, civil society, and business. And I mean, I'll point out at this juncture that the Wellcome Trust, has been critical in lots of these discussions and indeed actions about finding a vaccine, and that's part of civil society. But just, I mean, the other things I will say about COVID is, and universities are, it feels to me it's a time of rapid change. And that's rapid change in terms of trying to understand what's going on, but also rapid change in terms of policymakers and their agenda. So at NCVO, we had, and indeed still have, an ongoing partnership with Nottingham Trent University, where they've developed a barometer with us about what's happening to civil society. That sort of ability to help us build an evidence base. I mean, it's a very traditional role, but it's just as important as ever. And what I would sort of say had changed a bit, and you know, it's something that we could talk about needs to change in the future, is about speed. And there's a related issue there about data as well. So yeah, I feel very positive about what's sort of the relationship going forward.
Thank you, Carl. And I think we've heard so many fantastic examples there, and it is really good to see some very radical examples as well coming out. I mean, radical is a funny word, but actually going beyond what we traditionally know about, you know, these kind of relationships and partnerships to, as Vidya was saying, about the idea of incubating community organizations within your spaces, I think is a brilliant one if you can find a shared need and a shared focus and agenda, or as you said, moving the university to where the community is rather than vice versa. I mean, they're things that we often kind of say in theory, but seeing people do them in practice is extremely empowering. I'm just going to move to the Q&A, and then I'll hand back over to Paul to facilitate the rest, but we've had some wonderful questions coming in. Perhaps if I can start with Tony Gallagher's question, which is that many of the panel's comments have emphasised the issues of community voice or participatory decision making, particularly in relation to tackling inequalities. And there's a really interesting question there saying, how could these have implications for universities' role in terms of he said the quality of democracy in society, which is a huge point, but I think just in general, kind of how do universities kind of play a role in that participatory decision-making process, and how could that help strengthen, you know, how we can get community voice or community priorities into those challenging governance structures? Is there anybody that would like to go first from the panel on Tony's question there?
I'll give it a go, and I'm not going to do it justice now. But one of the things that I've been reflecting on is, given what I said about where government is, I think there's a real opportunity for other institutions and powerful institutions within society to really demonstrate trust in communities and raise up community voice. I think it's incumbent on all of us with institutional power to do that. And I'd like to almost see, and we are seeing some of this, that other actors in society move ahead of government. We often look to government to create change, and increasingly I'm thinking that actually they're I think on this front, in terms of community, they're going to be the laggards in terms of creating this change. So actually for universities to build trust with communities, to recognize the value of communities, to demonstrate that trust in the relational way in which they work, I think would be an incredibly powerful way to raise up community voice, community power. So I find it interesting at the moment. We do a lot of work about the future of the high street, and I'm finding it easier to engage with private sector owners of high street properties in terms of how they create more opportunities for community than I am engaging with the national government. So I think there's opportunities for higher education to point the way and to show others how this stuff can be done.
Thank you, Vidya. Anyone else on the panel? Farah?
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with Vidya there in terms of, like, I mean, I guess generally, I feel like a lot of change has to be inside out anyway. So kind of starting, you know, what do we need to change internally about ourselves in order to be in a position to create change? So really reflecting on what needs to change in the academy. But I also think there's like, you know, as you said, there's lots of commonality in what we've been saying, but actually, I'm not sure that we actually all know how to do all of this stuff. So I think we have a sense of like, yes, community voice is very important, participation is very important, and we have this sense that that's where there's hope. But I actually think in terms from like skills, capacities, processes, like I don't know that we've actually figured out how to do all of this. And so, like at the GLA, we describe a lot of our work as kind of trying to experiment and develop methodologies and skills and like figure it out, because I don't think the system has yet been in the right type of relationship with each other. So I think there's a really interesting role also for universities to think about, like how do we really carve out a new way of being in partnership and develop those skills, and what does voice actually mean? That's not just a survey, and like, so there's lots of learning to do, and there's actually not, like, as someone who, I don't find that there's like lots of spaces for learning. We've created some at the GLA, partially because there were like spaces that I felt like I needed, but also, where do people go to learn these skills and develop that understanding? And, that's not a master's also. Like, I feel like you have to do a master's sometimes to do these things, but, what are the other ways of generating insight and learning that can be offered to people who are operating in these spaces?
Great, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of comments from John Goddard in the Q&A, which I think are about the role of the university and the advocacy that you've all three talked about, this really important need to challenge narratives and to take a strong position. And John, I think, was probing the extent to which universities should be taking a position and advocating, or the risks, I guess John also alluded to, the risks of that, because there is something about the neutrality of universities that is also part of their value potentially. So any thoughts about the role of universities in advocacy and those risks around their important neutral role in civil society?
I'll kick off then, Paul. Well, I'm a member of something called the Voluntary Sector Studies Network, and I mean, since I sort of started working in the sector, some of the academics working in that network and around civil society and so on, they very much came from a tradition of actually starting out as activists and becoming academics rather than starting as academics and getting interested in the sector. So in some respects, it's always been there. I think what I would sort of highlight at the minute, and I have to possibly say this carefully, is that I think it's still important for us to have a strong relationship with academics here in terms of ensuring that our advocacy is supported by evidence and it's well supported, but also at times in challenging ourselves in our advocacy, because I mean, sometimes we get things wrong. Sometimes we base our advocacy not on good quality evidence, but on gut instinct. And I think having the academy as our critical friends seems to me to be an important role still.
Yeah, thank you. Vidya, any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think maybe in this, for me, there's a distinction between what academics can do and what the university as an institution does. Yeah. For me, having spent a long time in sort of policy and think tanks and things like that, worked with a lot of academics, and the best academics, I think, are brilliant advocates, but they do that from a position of evidence, and that makes them incredibly strong advocates. And I think that's an incredibly important role that universities, through their academics, can play. I recognize that for universities as institutions, there probably is a need to tread a more careful line. But I think in terms of, we've already highlighted the value of research to the sector and to individual kind of community organizations, I think that's where some of that advocacy can really be very, very strong.
Yeah, great, thank you. Farah?
Yeah, just a really quick point. I mean, I agree with Carl and Vidya in terms of some of that, but I also just feel like we need to kind of really challenge this perception of neutrality, and I feel like often we see kind of community perspectives as not neutral and as biased, but like, actually, I understand the role of research and that there's methodologies that are at play that kind of make things more kind of robust, but I think sometimes there's some of this kind of structural inequalities that are baked into our system come up in how we understand what neutrality is and who's afforded neutrality. So I guess it'd be interesting to see how universities can be part of kind of challenging our understanding of like where truth comes from, and like I feel like that is really coded structurally and kind of coded into structural inequalities. And so I'm really interested to see how we make space for kind of robust evidence, but also that robustness doesn't constantly kind of, I feel like sometimes the robustness can be a cover to dismiss community voice and lived realities. So, you know, I know it's complex, and I'd just be really interested in what that kind of exploration could be.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And yeah, I think Peter has made a really interesting sort of comment that builds on that and builds on what Vidya said. He comments that Vidya makes an important distinction between universities as institutions and academics, either individually or collectively. So we need to communicate better as an HE sector some of the differences. And I think that's a really important point. And it goes back to the point earlier about the narratives and the ways that we actually talk about and explain the role of universities. There's an anonymous question that picks up on one of the themes about really about governance and decision making. And I think all of you have talked about the need and the challenges around stronger community voice affecting decision making in civil society and in government. And this question says, it seems like there's a need for involving the community voice more into the decision making process within universities, and even the wider research infrastructure, i.e. within UKRI funding panels or REF panels potentially, etc. But often this faces a lot of resistance. It's quite a tension. So any thoughts, panel, on how we could potentially advocate for these quite dramatic structural changes? You know, I know that UKRI, for instance, are reframing their strategy at the moment. They want more engagement. They want more participation. How would you sort of make the case as to why and how that could be achieved? We'd really appreciate your advice.
I'll kick off, Paul. I was a user representative on the REF before, and I've sat on many SRC grant making panels and so on. And what was that quote about the 1970s about socialism? And the problem with socialism is that there's just too many bloody meetings. And you mean some of this I think is about making the case, but some of this is about practice and so on. And just from my experience of being on the REF, the commitment required to engage in some of these structures and so on, it's unbelievably large. And I think the number of people working in voluntary organizations that would have the ability to take part in some of these things, it's relatively small. You've got to have a really sort of willing employer. But then the other thing that I always sort of thought at NCVO is that I mean, still the main argument for this, and having been involved in many university-led research projects, is that I think we bring different knowledge, and I think we bring different resources and different skills, and we complement each other. And I think together, it's obvious to me that we come out with something better at the end. And if that in itself isn't reason enough, I don't know what is.
Thank you. Yeah, Farah, any thoughts?
Yeah, there's a report, I don't know if from the US, from a funder called Chicago Beyond, that I always go back to. And the report's called Why Am I Always Being Researched? From Insufficient Understanding to Authentic Truth. And that's a really useful resource for anyone that's trying to make this case in terms of, you know, I guess it's how many research reports can we do about the same topic? And, you know, I used to work at the Runnymede Trust, and sometimes I would look at reports that we had from 30 years ago and, you know, just feel like, oh my God, how little have some of the things changed, and like labor market inequalities and things like that. And I think the call for a radical shift in how we do things is also because we need much more radical solutions and understanding. And so kind of making the case around, you know, as Carl was saying, why that's important in terms of the actual outcome of the research and the quality of it and the impact that will have, but also just on a really practical level, like how can we create the support structures that will allow people to participate meaningfully in an accessible way. Because actually, I think what often, even where there's good intent, what people stumble on is the how, and you know, how can institutions like the one Emily leads or others create some of that scaffolding, some of that trellis that will allow people to connect directly with communities and bridge that gap. So, but yeah, do have a look at that report.
Yeah, thank you. Vidya, any thoughts?
So I'm not very familiar with the ref, and so I'm sort of speaking from a position of slight ignorance, but I suppose it strikes me that to really make other voices part of this and a valued part of this, we need to, I suppose, define excellence in research as being about usability, and the voice of communities being that, you know, part of how we understand excellence. And I think until we change the overall way in which we think about these things, I think it's hard for it to beyond potentially a sort of tokenistic approach. I think the other sort of thoughts I have are based on our own experience, past change, of trying to involve community businesses in our governance. And one of the things that really has come through to me is that, you know, putting one person on a group, whether it's a ref group or a board or whatever it is, who has very little power structurally compared to the other people sitting around the table, does absolutely nothing. So we have to find ways of actually sharing power with people who we invite into these processes, rather than putting them on so that we all feel better that they're somehow involved, because that's not a genuine involvement in any real meaningful way. So I think there's a lot of work to do about how to think about how we do this properly, because I think it's very easy to do it on a simplistic sort of surface level way, and you can tick your box and say, oh yes, we involved a community member in the process, but actually the power dynamics in that process probably mean that their voice is not influential, particularly heard. So I think it's quite challenging to get this right.
And would you point us to anywhere that you've found that's helped you with that challenge, Vidya? Because that's so wonderfully honest and it makes so much sense. And I think we probably all understand exactly what you're saying. How have you begun to sort of address that in your approach?
Yeah, so what we've done at Past Change, and we're by no, you know, we're not a higher education institution, this is just our experience of trying to address this. So for the last 6 years, we had a community business panel, which we gave it didn't have formal governance power, but we gave it real power in the way that we used it. So we listened to it very closely. We had an annual meeting of it and our board. So we built, and they said when we first got going, their role was to not just hold our feet to the fire, but bring fire to our feet, which felt quite at the time. But they saw their role very much as keeping us faithful to our mission, and we gave them the ability to do that. We're now moving to try and give more power to community businesses within our actual board. I suppose it's quite simplistic, really. What we're trying to do is we're bringing them in number. So actually we're recruiting 4 community businesses on a board of 10 or 11 people, so that they won't be the majority, but they will be much more powerful than the 1 or 2 that we've sort of tried to have in the past. And we've really struggled to get that integration to work properly. So I think part of it for us is just actually we need to create a core of people who can be strengthened by each other and can then have proper power within the overall kind of governance structure. So, you know, I'm not sure that even that is right, but that's where we've got to. But it is really challenging to really break up those power dynamics.
Yeah,
thank you so much, Vidya. And I think I also just wanted to share in terms of, because at the Institute, we spent the first 6 months of our life with a community advisory board at the helm, and before we really instated our external advisory board, which was deliberate because we wanted the programme to be shaped first and foremost by people working on the ground with local communities. And that was a board of 15 individuals who are still with us, you know, at the moment. And it was very, very challenging. And, you know, they were absolutely in command of the space, which is why we had a lot of the first kind of research programs that we had. But I wouldn't do it any other way. But I hear you on the challenges of doing it, because, you know, there were a lot of people that said, well, you're excluding a lot of the existing practice and evidence that we would normally turn to in this space, and you know, throwing the baton over to communities. But if you don't, when you have the privilege to have those spaces, if you don't hand them over or share them, we go round in the same circles, I feel. So so I think this notion of spaces for learning, which I think Farah mentioned, and the spaces that universities can provide physically and holistically that you mentioned, Vidya, I think is such an important takeaway that I've heard from this session. We're just getting into the final 10 minutes. I just wanted to pose another question that's come up in the chat, which is more on the side of, I suppose, the different missions that universities have, and thinking about, you know, sort of obviously teaching, learning, volunteering alongside research. Does anybody on the panel have any examples, really good examples that they've experienced or seen, either in the UK or internationally, of either service agendas in universities that have really connected with their local place, or on the teaching side? Because obviously, you know, universities have so many different hats that they wear. Any really good examples would be fantastic. I'm aware we're asking you as people that aren't working in universities as well. So you can also be provocative and say, well, here's one from outside the sector. So there we go. Carl, you've unmuted.
Well, certainly if you were to look at the US, you would look at Stanford and the Social Innovation Institute there, where the scholarship is very practically engaged, what my academic friend calls pracademia. And there, it seems to me that their research agenda is very much, it's very relevant to sort of what the communities that they're sort of working with are. I mean, in some respects, you know, I've got some colleagues at UCL, and we're in a conversation at the moment actually about what's the role of UCL in the community in London, and one of the reasons I'm glad I'm part of this discussion is that I'm hoping I might get some answers on this as well. But I keep coming back to this thing about relevance. And when you sort of think about the future of sort of universities and what's happening in terms of digital and disruption and so on, what is it that's going to separate you out and make you different? And for me, it's this community engagement that gives people, you know, I mean, that sort of sense of purpose, and it's not just a service. That's what's going to be different about you.
Thank you, Carl. And we've got some really good examples coming in the chat as well, about particularly both engagement, but also education initiatives with local schools in the local area, which is really good. So do keep those coming as well. Any of the other panelists about either kind of connecting through sort of volunteering, the role of students, for example, or indeed universities as sites of education, of course.
I'm afraid I don't have like lots of great examples, unfortunately, but I know that in London, King's University has also really kind of spent a lot of time and effort trying to think about both in terms of how they connect their students to the local boroughs that they're kind of based in, how their role as a civic university, you know, the different challenges that they put there to the students, and how they kind of both in terms of who they recruit into university and the students that go there, but also then the experience that students have whilst they're there in terms of placements with community. I mean, thinking about it from a slightly different perspective also, like when I was at Runnymede, we used to have a lot of universities that would get in contact with us asking if they could place their students at Runnymede as part of their learning journey. And you know, I can understand that that's a really, really valuable experience, but for at that point we were a staff team of 4. You know, the capacity to take on students wasn't something that we had at the time. And so there's also a kind of, how do we do it in a way that's kind of beneficial for students, and students have the proper support and guide, kind of pastoral care that they need in terms of any volunteering opportunity. But also when you're very small organizations, you can't necessarily absorb volunteers unless you have that kind of formal structure in place as well.
I think that's a really good point in terms of, you know, the expectation on when you're working with, you know, what are often very small organisations with limited resources, what's the wraparound you need to provide if you want to do service placements or, sort of learning placements. I think that's a really good reflection from the outside in, actually. And we had the same when I was working at another smaller charity. And of course, you want to have, students there because they bring an enormous amount of reflection and insight, but it does come obviously at a cost in terms of staff time, which it would be great if universities could help to support, of course. Just moving to any final reflections, is there anything else that anyone on the panel wanted to add? Perhaps something that you feel it would be really great if everybody sort of took away from this session, either as a challenge, for how we move into the next stages of, she says, well, I would say easing of lockdown, but I think it looks all a little bit uncertain. Certainly no one should be going on holiday apparently this year, so as of this morning. But any final reflections, any challenge or I suppose piece of learning you would like people to take away today in terms of working between universities and the community sector? Perhaps if I start with you, Vidya, as you're not on mute, that would be great.
Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to make this final point, which is when we worked with these 40 community leaders a couple of weeks ago and we're talking to them about community power, what they all said, sort of, and this we hear this time and time again, is that most of what happens in their communities, most of what they achieve in terms of their community businesses or their community activism or change happens in spite of the system and not because of it. And that makes me both angry and sad and numerous other things, but I think that there's a real opportunity for universities to change that and to really start to be enablers of community rather than, I think a lot of community leaders feel that they're constantly fighting the system, fighting institutions that hold power in order to get where they want to get. And I think there's a real opportunity for those who do hold power, like universities, to really proactively start to change that.
Thank you, Vidya. If I can go to Carl, that would be great.
I think what I've taken from the conversation today is actually just how much is going on and how much really good and positive things are out there that we can learn from. But I guess the question is, how good are we at sharing it beyond these sort of quite small, dense networks that we've got? How do we get this a bit more into the mainstream?
Thank you, Carl. And I think we'll definitely take that away in terms of through the Civic University Network, how can we actually join up and make more visible all of the different examples of really brilliant civic activity that are happening. So thank you. Farah, any final takeaways?
Just to contradict something that I said earlier, but so, we've spoken a lot about relationships, and I do really believe that they are at the heart of like how change happens and how culture shifts, but also, I guess, reflecting on what, the caveat with that is the inequalities that are built into relationships as well, in the sense that there's certain groups will know about all of this amazing work and what they can access from universities and how they can get support from universities and work collaboratively with them, and to do a bit of kind of paying attention to where universities and all of us have relationships and where we don't, and how we address that. Because there's I always reflect on one of the responses to one of our surveys where we were trying to connect the system up a bit better, and someone said, well, I don't need this asks and offers board, because if I need something I can just call my local authority. And for me that was kind of really symptomatic of the inequalities of relationships, that there are people who have that direct access and there are others who don't, and that is based on kind of like reflect the inequalities that exist in our country, in our city, and so to kind of focus on relationships, but also think about where relationships are missing, and those will often mirror kind of the structural inequalities that exist.
No, thank you, Farah. And I think that is a perfect and very important call to end on there. So thank you. Paul, just going to hand over to you to wrap up, but just from me, an enormous thank you for such an honest, open and far-reaching discussion from our panelists, and also to all of you in the chat for all of your examples, which we are going to make sure that we capture. As always, it's such an active chat at these events, which is exactly why we love the Civic University Network coming together. So over to you, Paul.
Yeah, just to echo our thanks, really. And I guess it's that's something that's really come through to me listening to this conversation is around how we communicate this work and how we talk about it and how we describe it and how we make sense of the role of the universities. And Farah, I was really reassured when you said that you struggled to explain what your job was to your family, because I have a similar problem too. But yeah, and that says quite a lot perhaps about the kind of complex space in which we work. But I think what you've really done is enrich our understanding almost of how universities can contribute and how you see their contribution. And Carl, I really loved your point at the beginning. I think it was you who said, let's not put ourselves in boxes, let's think about common purpose here. So that common purpose and those themes that we've identified around relevance and power and advocacy, etc. There's such rich data in this conversation. We will put it up on our website. We will look at the chat, and I think we will try to just reflect and make sense of how you've really helped us move this agenda forward. And a huge thank you to our audience as well, who've joined us for the session today and for your really rich contributions. There's a pop-up coming up on the screen which asks you a simple question, really, and invites you to just reflect on what you might do with the experience that you've had. And while you're doing that, just to say, there's a Twitter handle that I'm sure you're aware of, but that gives you a chance to interact with the conference. It's going on for another day and a half, so stay in touch. There's a place space Padlet board where you can just share thoughts. You can access really helpful resources on our members area, which is free to join and is a really rich and helpful place to go if you're interested in this civic space. If you don't subscribe to the network newsletter, you can also join that, and the details are on the screen. And those links are going to be provided in the chat function. So yes, thanks again and see you all soon. And thank you, panel.